Some people spend their entire lives trying to be noticed. Others spend theirs hoping no one ever looks too closely. Grace Whitmore belonged to the second group, and by the end of that ordinary Tuesday morning, every person inside St. Anne's Regional Medical Center would wish they had paid attention much sooner. Before we continue, thank you for supporting our channel. Your encouragement means everything to us and inspires us to keep bringing stories like this to life. If you enjoy powerful stories about courage, humility, and unexpected heroes, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel so we can continue sharing many more unforgettable journeys with you in the videos ahead. At exactly 7:12 a.m., the emergency department settled into the familiar rhythm that came with another busy weekday. Monitors chimed softly, rolling carts moved across polished floors, and nurses exchanged updates as the morning shift officially took over. Grace Whitmore quietly adjusted the cuff on an elderly patient's arm before recording his blood pressure with neat, careful handwriting. She offered him a warm smile, wished him a comfortable morning, and slipped back into the hallway before anyone noticed she had already completed 3 other patient checks ahead of schedule. That was Grace. She never announced herself. She simply kept moving. Most of the staff barely remembered when she had been hired 6 months earlier. Some assumed she had transferred from another hospital. Others guessed she was simply another quiet nurse filling staffing shortages until someone permanent arrived. They rarely asked her opinion during trauma briefings. They rarely included her in conversations over coffee. Around the nurses' station, she had earned an unkind nickname spoken with casual amusement whenever she walked away. The invisible nurse. Grace had heard it more than once. She never reacted. Across the department, Dr. Nathan Holloway strode through the automatic doors carrying a fresh cup of coffee and the confidence of someone accustomed to being the smartest person in every room. As head of emergency medicine, Nathan expected immediate responses, perfect efficiency, and unquestioned authority. He glanced toward Grace as she organized supply drawers with quiet precision. "Whitmore," he called without slowing down. "Inventory isn't going to save lives. Leave the important decisions to people trained for them." A few nearby residents chuckled politely. One young nurse lowered her eyes, pretending not to hear. Grace simply nodded. "Yes, doctor." She closed the drawer gently and continued preparing fresh 4 kits exactly the way she had planned before being interrupted. Nathan watched her for another second, almost irritated by her calm. Most people defended themselves. Some apologized too much. Grace did neither. She accepted every sharp remark with the same composed expression, as though his words never reached the place where confidence lived. 10 minutes later, paramedics wheeled in a retired schoolteacher suffering from severe dehydration after spending hours outdoors during an unexpected summer heat advisory. The treatment plan appeared straightforward, and Nathan immediately directed 2 residents through the evaluation. Grace quietly noticed the patient's hands trembling in a pattern that did not quite match dehydration alone. She glanced once toward the cardiac monitor, then toward the man's eyes. Something about the rhythm of his breathing felt familiar, though she said nothing. Instead, she calmly prepared additional monitoring equipment and placed it beside the bed without interrupting anyone. One resident looked at the extra equipment with mild confusion. "Nobody asked for that," he whispered. Grace answered with her usual gentle voice. "Sometimes it's better to have it ready before someone needs to ask." The resident shrugged and walked away, assuming she was simply being overly cautious. Nathan never even looked in her direction. To him, Grace Whitmore remained exactly what everyone believed she was, a quiet nurse who stayed out of the spotlight, followed instructions, and never stood out. None of them noticed how quickly she assessed every room she entered. None of them questioned why she always seemed to know where equipment was needed before anyone called for it. None of them wondered why the calmest person in the emergency department never appeared surprised by chaos. They ignored the quiet nurse because they believed there was nothing remarkable to see. Outside, beyond the hospital parking structure, a distant sound barely noticeable against the morning traffic began to echo across the clear blue sky. Grace turned away from the patient's bedside just as the faint sound overhead disappeared again beneath the constant rhythm of ambulance sirens and city traffic. No one else seemed to notice it. Inside the emergency department, another call arrived before anyone had time to think about the strange noise outside. Two construction workers entered supporting a middle-aged electrician whose breathing had become increasingly difficult after spending hours inside an overheated warehouse. Dr. Nathan Holloway immediately stepped forward, directing residents with crisp confidence while assigning grace to routine documentation instead of patient assessment. "Stay with the charts, Whitmore," he said without looking at her. "We already have enough experienced people handling this one." Grace quietly accepted the clipboard and moved toward the nurse's station, but her attention remained fixed on the patient's slow movements. His fingertips carried a faint bluish color that appeared for only a moment before fading again. She watched the monitor, then the patient's posture, then the way his shoulders tightened every few breaths. Something about the pattern did not fit the obvious diagnosis. One of the residents reached for a standard oxygen mask, while another prepared medication according to protocol. Grace glanced toward the supply cabinet, calmly removed a different monitoring device, and placed it on the counter closest to the treatment room without saying a word. "You worry too much," one resident laughed as he noticed the equipment. "Dr. Holloway already has everything under control." Grace offered a small smile. "I hope you are right." Nathan noticed the exchange and walked into the hallway with visible impatience. "Whitmore, I asked you to document, not second-guess my team." Several nurses looked up from their computers. The conversation around the station stopped for a moment. Grace lowered her eyes respectfully. "I was only preparing in case it became necessary." Nathan folded his arms. Preparation is useful when someone actually asks for it. Confidence without authority only creates confusion. A few quiet chuckles drifted through the department before everyone returned to work. Grace simply nodded once more. "Understood, doctor." She picked up the clipboard and resumed entering patient information with the same steady expression she always carried. Across the room, the patient's condition shifted unexpectedly. His breathing became shallower, and the monitor displayed changes that caught the attention of one of the residents. "Dr. Holloway," he called, "I think we should expand the evaluation." Nathan immediately ordered additional testing, only to discover the exact monitoring device Grace had quietly prepared was already waiting within arm's reach. For the briefest moment, he looked toward her with mild surprise before turning his attention back to the patient. The equipment was connected within seconds, allowing the team to identify the complication quickly and adjust the treatment plan before the situation became more serious. The patient stabilized gradually, and relieved family members thanked everyone gathered around the bed. Nathan accepted their gratitude with professional confidence, explaining the successful intervention while never mentioning the equipment that had somehow appeared exactly where it was needed. Grace quietly returned and used supplies to storage without expecting acknowledgement. A younger nurse watched her from across the hallway. "How did you know they would need that?" she asked softly. Grace paused for a moment before answering. "Sometimes experience teaches you to notice small details before they become large ones." "Where did you learn that?" the younger nurse asked with genuine curiosity. Grace smiled politely, but offered no explanation. "From a long time ago." Before another question could follow, the hospital's overhead paging system announced an incoming emergency transport requiring immediate preparation. Nathan quickly organized his staff, assigning responsibilities with practiced authority while once again placing Grace on the outer edge of the response. She accepted the assignment without complaint and quietly moved toward the ambulance entrance. As the automatic doors opened, a cool breeze swept through the corridor. In the distance, the unmistakable sound of powerful rotor blades returned, this time louder than before, causing several people near the entrance to pause and glance toward the bright morning sky. The growing roar above the hospital slowly drew more eyes toward the windows, but inside the emergency department another ambulance arrived first, pushing every distraction aside. Paramedics hurried through the entrance with a middle-aged man suffering from severe chest discomfort after collapsing at a nearby manufacturing plant. The waiting area instantly became crowded as family members stepped aside and staff moved with practiced urgency. Dr. Nathan Holloway immediately took command, assigning residents, respiratory therapists, and senior nurses to every position while barely acknowledging Grace standing beside the supply cart. "Whitmore, remain outside Trauma Room 3, he instructed firmly. "We need experienced personnel inside." Keep the hallway clear and stay available if someone needs additional supplies. Grace answered with the same calm voice she always used. Yes, doctor. She quietly stepped aside without a trace of frustration. Several staff members exchanged knowing smiles. One resident whispered just loudly enough for others to hear. She always looks relieved when she is kept away from the difficult cases. Another replied with a quiet laugh. Some people are simply not built for pressure. Grace continued organizing equipment as though she had heard nothing. Through the glass doors, she carefully watched the team begin their assessment. The patient answered questions clearly, but his left hand repeatedly drifted toward his shoulder while his breathing remained strangely measured despite obvious discomfort. Grace noticed the rhythm immediately. It reminded her of something she had seen many years before, somewhere she had long ago decided never to mention. She quietly walked toward a nearby cabinet, removed a portable ultrasound unit, checked its battery, and positioned it just outside the treatment room before returning to her assignment. One of the residents stepped into the hallway and frowned. "Who brought this here?" he asked. Grace answered honestly. "I thought it might save time if it became necessary." Before the resident could respond, Nathan emerged from the room. His expression hardened the moment he saw the machine. "Whitmore, this is exactly the problem," he said loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "You keep inserting yourself into decisions that are well beyond your responsibility." Several visitors glanced toward the nurse's station. Conversation slowed. Grace remained perfectly still. "I only wanted the equipment nearby in case you requested it." Nathan folded his arms. "Medicine is not about guessing. It is about discipline. When you decide to improvise without being asked, you create confusion for the entire team." Grace lowered her eyes respectfully. "I understand." Nathan turned toward one of the residents. "Please return the machine. We will request it if we actually need it." The resident rolled the equipment away while another nurse offered Grace a sympathetic look. No one defended her. No one questioned Nathan's judgment. To everyone watching, the lesson seemed obvious. The quiet nurse had overstepped her place again. Inside the treatment room, however, the patient's symptoms began changing in subtle ways. Initial test results failed to explain the discomfort completely, prompting Nathan to reconsider his approach. After another careful examination, he paused, thinking through possibilities before finally saying, "Bring me the portable ultrasound." The resident froze for a brief second before hurrying into the hallway to retrieve the same machine that had just been returned. Grace quietly rolled it back without a single word. Within minutes, the additional images revealed an unexpected condition that altered the treatment plan and allowed the physicians to respond quickly before the patient's situation became significantly more complicated. Relief spread across the room as the patient's breathing gradually eased. Family members thanked the medical team, grateful that the problem had been recognized in time. Nathan accepted their appreciation professionally, but for the first time that morning his eyes briefly settled on Grace. She simply disconnected and used cables, wiped down the equipment, and wheeled it silently back toward storage. She neither expected recognition nor sought an explanation. She behaved as though quiet service was all she had ever intended to provide. Outside, the sound overhead grew unmistakably louder. Hospital employees from upper floors began gathering near windows. Security officers stepped outside into the parking lot. The deep, rhythmic echo of approaching rotor blades rolled across the campus with increasing intensity, and this time everyone realized it was heading directly toward the hospital. The steady rhythm of the approaching aircraft echoed through every hallway until conversations across the emergency department gradually faded into curious silence. Nurses paused while pushing medication carts. Visitors drifted toward the large windows overlooking the rooftop landing area. Even patients who were able to stand carefully stepped closer to see what was drawing so much attention. Grace continued replacing supplies inside a treatment room as though nothing unusual was happening. She counted gauze packages one by one, checked expiration dates, and quietly returned each item to its proper place with the same deliberate precision she brought to every task. Across the room, Dr. Nathan Holloway noticed her complete lack of curiosity and frowned. "Does nothing surprise you, Whitmore?" he asked with a hint of irritation. Grace looked up politely. "There is always another patient who needs something, doctor." Nathan shook his head with a dismissive smile. "That is because you never look beyond the next checklist." Several staff members nearby nodded in quiet agreement before turning their attention back toward the windows. Moments later, another emergency call interrupted the growing excitement. An elderly military veteran entered the department accompanied by his daughter after experiencing sudden dizziness during a community event. The man remained calm despite appearing unusually pale. Nathan assigned a resident to begin the evaluation while directing Grace to assist only with basic intake. As Grace gently helped the veteran into bed, she noticed a small bracelet around his wrist carrying a faded military unit emblem that most people would have overlooked completely. Her eyes rested on it for barely a second before she asked in a calm voice, "Sir, have you noticed any ringing in your ears today?" The veteran looked at her with quiet surprise. "Since early this morning," he admitted. "How did you know to ask that?" Grace smiled softly. Sometimes small details matter. Before the conversation continued, Nathan entered the room reviewing laboratory requests. "Standard evaluation," he instructed. "Nothing unusual here." Grace hesitated only briefly before speaking. "Doctor, would you consider checking his balance and vision again before transport? I think there may be another factor involved." Nathan sighed heavily. "Based on what?" Grace answered honestly. "His posture changed when he sat down, and he keeps adjusting to sounds on only one side." Nathan folded the chart shut. "You are reading far too much into ordinary symptoms again." The veteran quietly watched the exchange without saying a word. Grace simply nodded and stepped back. Several minutes later, while the resident completed the examination, the veteran unexpectedly mentioned the very symptoms Grace had quietly observed. Nathan paused. Without comment, he ordered the additional neurological assessment she had suggested only moments earlier. The tests confirmed an early condition that could now be treated promptly before becoming far more serious. The veteran's daughter looked relieved as she thanked every member of the medical team. Grace quietly adjusted the blanket over the patient's shoulders before slipping toward the hallway unnoticed. The veteran watched her leave, his thoughtful expression lingering for several seconds. "That nurse," he quietly asked his daughter. "How long has she worked here?" She shrugged. "I do not know." The veteran slowly nodded. "She carries herself like someone who has spent years making difficult decisions." His daughter smiled politely, assuming he simply appreciated Grace's kindness. Nathan overheard part of the conversation, but dismissed it without comment. To him, Grace remained an unusually observant nurse who occasionally guessed correctly. Yet the number of fortunate guesses was beginning to grow difficult to ignore. As Grace reached the nurse's station, the deep sound overhead became almost impossible to mistake. This time the windows vibrated slightly as a dark helicopter swept across the hospital campus before banking toward the rooftop landing pad. Every face in the emergency department turned upward except Grace, who quietly closed a patient chart, placed her pen into her pocket, and took one slow breath as though she had been expecting that sound all morning. The powerful rhythm of the helicopter settled into a steady thunder that seemed to vibrate through the walls of St. Anne's Regional Medical Center. Doctors, nurses, patients, and visitors crowded every available window overlooking the rooftop landing pad. Conversation stopped almost instantly as the dark aircraft descended with calm precision onto the marked circle above the hospital. The spinning blades gradually slowed while several uniformed military personnel stepped onto the roof with disciplined purpose. No one inside the emergency department understood why they had arrived. Speculation spread through the hallways almost immediately. Some believed an important government official had been injured. Others guessed a military training exercise had gone off course. Dr. Nathan Holloway straightened his white coat before turning toward the charge nurse. "Make sure the trauma bay is prepared," he instructed confidently. "If they are bringing us a critical patient, I want this department ready." The staff hurried to follow his orders. Stretchers were positioned. Equipment was checked again. Residents gathered beside the entrance waiting to impress whoever was coming through the doors. Grace quietly finished labeling a medication tray before returning it to its proper shelf. She did not move toward the windows with everyone else. She simply continued helping an elderly patient adjust his blanket before offering him a reassuring smile. One of the younger nurses noticed her lack of interest and laughed softly. "Grace, this is probably the most exciting thing that has happened all month. Do you really not want to see?" Grace looked toward the ceiling for only a brief moment before answering. "Someone will tell us what is happening soon enough." The younger nurse shook her head with amused disbelief. You really are impossible to surprise. A minute later, the elevator nearest the emergency department opened. Four uniformed service members stepped into the hallway with calm professionalism. Their movements were deliberate rather than hurried, and every person they passed instinctively stepped aside. At their center walked a tall officer with silver hair, steady eyes, and the quiet confidence of someone long accustomed to responsibility. Without raising his voice, he approached the reception desk. "Good morning," he said politely. "I am Colonel Daniel Mercer." The receptionist immediately stood. "How may we help you, Colonel?" Mercer reached into his jacket and presented official identification before asking a question no one expected. "Which member of your staff is supervising Nurse Grace Whitmore today?" The receptionist blinked with visible confusion. "Grace Whitmore." Mercer nodded once. "Yes, sir," she answered carefully. "She is one of our emergency department nurses." Nathan immediately stepped forward wearing a professional smile. "I am Dr. Nathan Holloway, head of emergency medicine. Is there a problem involving Nurse Whitmore?" Mercer looked directly at him. "No problem, doctor. We are here specifically because of Nurse Whitmore." The hallway fell completely silent. Several nurses exchanged puzzled glances. One resident quietly whispered, "Did he say Grace?" Another answered, "That cannot be right." Nathan appeared equally confused but maintained his composure. "May I ask the purpose of your visit?" Mercer paused briefly before replying. "I can discuss that after I speak with her." Nathan glanced across the department until he spotted Grace quietly organizing patient charts beside the nurse's station. She seemed completely unaware that every eye had suddenly turned toward her. "Whitmore," Nathan called across the room. "Would you come here for a moment?" Grace looked up calmly, placed the final chart into its proper folder, and walked toward the gathering with the same measured pace she always used. Staff members stepped aside as she approached, unsure why the military delegation appeared interested in the quiet nurse almost everyone had overlooked for months. Grace stopped a respectful distance from Colonel Mercer and offered a polite smile. Before anyone could say another word, the colonel's posture subtly changed. His expression grew serious, his shoulders straightened with unmistakable discipline, and the entire emergency department sensed that whatever happened next was about to change everything they believed they knew about Grace Whitmore. Grace stopped exactly 3 feet in front of Colonel Daniel Mercer. Around them, the emergency department had become completely silent. Doctors stood shoulder to shoulder with nurses. Patients who were able to sit upright leaned forward to watch. Even the reception phones continued ringing unanswered as every eye focused on the quiet woman who had spent months blending into the background. Colonel Mercer held her gaze for a brief moment before speaking in a calm, measured voice. "Please confirm your identity." Grace answered without hesitation. "Grace Elizabeth Whitmore." The colonel gave a single nod. "State your rank." The question seemed to freeze the room. Nathan Holloway frowned with visible confusion. One resident quietly laughed under his breath, assuming the officer had mistaken Grace for someone else. Grace remained perfectly composed. She looked directly at Colonel Mercer and answered with quiet confidence. "Former Staff Sergeant, United States Army Medical Corps. Combat medic. Honorably retired." The silence that followed felt almost unreal. The young nurse, standing beside the reception desk, slowly lowered the clipboard she had been holding. Nathan stared at Grace as though he had never seen her before. Colonel Mercer immediately brought his right hand up in a crisp military salute. The 3 service members standing behind him did the same without a moment of hesitation. Grace returned the salute naturally, her movement smooth, disciplined, and unmistakably practiced. There was no uncertainty in the gesture. It was the kind of movement built through years of repetition rather than memory alone. Nathan blinked several times before finally finding his voice. "Grace, you served in the military?" Grace lowered her hand and answered simply, "Yes, doctor. You never mentioned it." She offered a polite smile. No one ever asked. The words were spoken without resentment or pride. They were simply true. Colonel Mercer reached into a leather portfolio and carefully removed a sealed document bearing an official military insignia. He handed it to Nathan. "Dr. Holloway, this confirms her record." Nathan accepted the document with uncertain hands. His eyes moved across the page, then returned to Grace before reading again, as though his mind refused to accept what was written there. The record listed years of overseas humanitarian deployments, advanced trauma certifications, commendations for extraordinary medical leadership, and recognition for developing emergency treatment procedures later adopted during military training programs. Nathan slowly looked up. These qualifications. He stopped speaking, unable to finish the sentence. Colonel Mercer answered for him. Many physicians have studied techniques influenced by Staff Sergeant Whitmore's work without ever realizing whose experience helped shape those protocols. Several residents exchanged stunned expressions. One quietly remembered how Grace had anticipated equipment before every complication. Another recalled how she always recognized subtle warning signs before anyone else. The younger nurse who had once called her impossible to surprise now understood why nothing inside the emergency department ever seemed to shake her confidence. Grace remained exactly as she had been all morning, standing quietly with relaxed shoulders and a gentle expression. Nothing about her posture suggested she expected admiration. Colonel Mercer smiled respectfully. Staff Sergeant Whitmore, Headquarters requested that I personally deliver an invitation to next month's Military Medical Leadership Conference. Your experience continues to save lives, and we would be honored if you would address our newest combat medics. Grace accepted the envelope with both hands. Thank you, Colonel. It would be my privilege. Around the department, no one spoke. The woman they had dismissed as ordinary had quietly carried an extraordinary past without asking anyone to recognize it. And for the first time, every conversation, every overlooked moment, and every calm decision she had made suddenly carried an entirely different meaning. No one in the emergency department returned to work immediately. The atmosphere had changed too completely for that. Conversations that had once drifted casually through the hallways had disappeared, replaced by respectful silence as every member of the staff looked at Grace Whitmore with entirely different eyes. Colonel Daniel Mercer carefully turned toward the physicians and nurses gathered around the station. There is something else you should know, he said calmly. Staff Sergeant Whitmore never asked us to reveal any of this. In fact, she specifically requested that her military record remain private after leaving active service. Nathan Holloway looked from the official documents back to Grace. Why would someone with credentials like these choose to work here without saying a word? Grace answered before the colonel could respond. Because I wanted to be a nurse again, not a reputation. Her voice remained gentle, carrying none of the pride everyone expected. Patients deserve to meet the person standing beside them, not the titles listed in an old file. The words settled over the room with surprising weight. Colonel Mercer smiled faintly. That answer sounds exactly like the woman I remember. He glanced toward the younger residents who were listening carefully. Years ago, during a multinational medical training exercise, instructors created a trauma scenario designed to overwhelm every team in attendance. Experienced physicians struggled to organize the response within the required time. Staff Sergeant Whitmore quietly stepped forward, reorganized the entire treatment sequence, and completed the exercise faster than anyone believed possible. That training model is still studied today. One resident slowly whispered. That explains how she always seemed to know what came next. Another remembered the portable ultrasound. A senior nurse recalled the veteran whose condition Grace had recognized before anyone else. Piece by piece, dozens of small moments that had once seemed like fortunate guesses suddenly fit together into a picture no one had imagined. Nathan lowered his eyes for a moment. Every time she suggested something, I assumed she was overstepping. Colonel Mercer answered respectfully rather than critically. You assumed she lacked experience because she never used it to impress anyone. Grace quietly shook her head. Dr. Holloway was responsible for a busy department. He made decisions with the information he had. Nathan looked genuinely surprised by her willingness to defend him. After everything I said to you? Grace offered the same calm smile she had worn since the beginning of the day. We all see people through incomplete information sometimes. An elderly patient who had been resting nearby slowly raised his hand. It was the retired veteran Grace had cared for earlier that morning. May I say something? Everyone turned toward him. I spent 30 years wearing a uniform, he said thoughtfully. The people who talked the least were usually the ones everyone depended on when things became difficult. I recognized that in her before I knew anything about her past. Several nurses nodded quietly. The younger nurse who had jokingly called Grace impossible to surprise stepped closer. I owe you an apology, she said sincerely. I thought you were just shy. Grace smiled warmly. There is nothing to apologize for. Colonel Mercer reached into his portfolio once more and removed a small presentation case. He opened it carefully, revealing a simple military challenge coin with the insignia of an elite medical unit. This belongs with someone who never stopped serving, he said. Grace accepted it with quiet gratitude, gently closing the case without displaying it to anyone else. She slipped it into the pocket of her scrub top as naturally as if it were an ordinary pen. There was no dramatic speech, no celebration, and no attempt to stand at the center of the room. She simply thanked the colonel, glanced toward the patient board mounted on the wall, noticed that another examination room required assistance, and calmly started walking in that direction. Every person watching understood something profound in that simple decision. Grace Whitmore had never been working for recognition. Recognition had finally found her. Grace reached examination room 5 before anyone else moved. A young mother sat beside her anxious teenage son, who had injured his wrist during a high school baseball practice. The boy looked more embarrassed than hurt, apologizing repeatedly for interrupting what he assumed had become an important military visit. Grace smiled warmly as she examined his hand with calm confidence. You are exactly where you need to be, she said gently. Every patient matters. Those simple words echoed through the hallway, where several nurses quietly watched her continue working as though nothing extraordinary had happened. Colonel Daniel Mercer remained near the nurses' station, speaking briefly with the hospital administrator who had rushed downstairs after hearing that military personnel had arrived. Within minutes, additional department supervisors gathered around him, eager to understand why their quiet emergency nurse had received such remarkable respect. Mercer answered each question patiently without exaggeration. Staff Sergeant Whitmore never sought recognition, he explained. During her years of service, she became known for one quality above every other. Whenever situations became confusing, people looked for her because she brought calm before solutions. Technical skill can be taught. Character cannot. Nathan Holloway listened silently. Every sentence seemed to remind him of another moment when Grace had quietly solved a problem before anyone else recognized it. He remembered the portable ultrasound, the neurological assessment, the careful observations, and every suggestion he had dismissed without consideration. None of those moments had been lucky guesses. They had been the product of years of disciplined experience hidden behind remarkable humility. The hospital administrator finally approached Grace while she finished placing a supportive wrap around the teenager's wrist. Nurse Whitmore, she said respectfully, when you are finished, would you please join us for a moment? Grace completed the final instruction for the patient, wished him a quick recovery, and only then walked toward the gathering. The administrator smiled warmly. On behalf of St. Anne's Regional Medical Center, I want to thank you for the professionalism you have shown every single day. We believed we hired an excellent emergency nurse. Today we learned we were fortunate enough to welcome someone whose service has influenced medical professionals across the country. Grace lowered her eyes modestly. Thank you, but I have only tried to take care of the people who came through these doors. Colonel Mercer nodded. That answer is exactly why we continue to hold you in such high regard. Several patients who had witnessed the morning quietly began applauding. The sound spread naturally through the emergency department until nurses, technicians, physicians, reception staff, and visitors joined together. No one had been instructed to applaud. It simply happened because respect had replaced assumption. Nathan stepped forward once the applause faded. For the first time since Grace had arrived at the hospital months earlier, he addressed her not as a subordinate, but as a colleague. Grace, he said sincerely, there were many opportunities when I should have listened instead of judging. I confused quietness with inexperience, and I allowed my assumptions to become facts in my own mind. I regret that deeply. Grace answered with the same kindness that had defined every conversation that morning. We all continue learning, Doctor. That is true in medicine, and it is true in life. Nathan smiled faintly, grateful that she had accepted his apology without hesitation. A young resident who had once laughed at her suggestions quietly stepped beside Grace. Would you ever consider teaching us some of what you have learned? Grace looked around the department, filled with familiar faces that no longer saw her as invisible. If sharing experience helps even one patient receive better care, she replied gently, then I would be honored. Around the room, Heads nodded in agreement. The emergency department had not simply discovered Grace Whitmore's past. It had finally recognized the extraordinary professional who had been standing beside them every single day. The following Monday morning felt remarkably different, even though the emergency department looked exactly the same. The monitors still chimed, ambulances still arrived at the entrance, and families still waited anxiously for good news. Yet something invisible had changed forever. The nickname that had quietly followed Grace Whitmore through the hallways had disappeared without anyone mentioning it again. No one called her the invisible nurse anymore. They called her by her name. New staff members who joined the department during the following weeks quickly noticed something unusual. Whenever a difficult case arrived, experienced nurses often glanced toward Grace before making their next decision. Not because she demanded authority, but because her calm presence had become a source of quiet confidence for everyone around her. Dr. Nathan Holloway changed as well. During morning briefings, he no longer dismissed questions simply because they came from younger staff members. Instead, he regularly paused before final decisions and asked, "Does anyone see something we may have overlooked?" More often than not, he looked toward Grace with genuine respect. She never answered immediately. She studied every patient carefully before offering thoughtful observations in the same gentle voice she had always used. The difference was that now everyone listened. Several months later, the emergency department launched a new mentoring program for recently hired nurses. Hospital leadership unanimously asked Grace to design the clinical training sessions. She accepted only after requesting one condition. Every participant would be encouraged to ask questions freely, regardless of experience or position. Good ideas do not belong to rank, she explained during the first orientation. They belong to people willing to notice what others miss. The words quickly became part of the department's culture. Young nurses who once doubted themselves gradually found confidence. Residents became more collaborative. Communication improved throughout every shift. Even patient satisfaction scores quietly reached the highest levels the hospital had recorded in years. One afternoon, the teenage baseball player whose wrist Grace had treated returned carrying a handwritten thank you card. He smiled as he handed it to her. "You told me every patient matters," he said. "I just wanted you to know I never forgot that." Grace thanked him warmly before placing the card inside her locker beside dozens of similar notes collected over the years. None of them mentioned military service. None of them praised medals or titles. They simply thanked a nurse who had shown kindness when people needed it most. As her shift ended that evening, Grace changed out of her scrubs and walked toward the employee parking lot. The sunset painted the sky with warm shades of gold, while the familiar sound of another helicopter echoed faintly somewhere far above the city. She looked up for only a brief moment before smiling to herself and continuing toward her car. Behind her, inside the hospital, a newly hired nurse asked Dr. Nathan Holloway a simple question. "Doctor, how does someone become as good as Nurse Whitmore?" Nathan watched Grace disappear beyond the parking lot before answering with complete honesty. "You start by caring more about people than recognition. The rest comes with time." Grace